Thank you. This is giving you a view of some work that we carried out. I carried out with my my colleague, Professor Steve Evans, in late 2020 and early 2021. It was looking to provide some foundation industry scenarios to help with the way in which UKRI was thinking about allocating and measuring the performance of some of the investments that that it's been making in research into the sector. As part of that, we looked at about just under 50 reports. We had a number of long interviews with key people across the foundation industries, and we set up and ran some workshops. So that gave us quite a lot of initial data. So that's the background of what I want to cover. If we can have the next slide, then just very quickly, this is me. I've been not at universities, but most of my career has been in business. I joined Cambridge 11 years ago, and I've been working at the Centre for Industrial Sustainability, where a lot of the work I do is about converting research into actionable things for industry and for individual businesses. I've got a range of other experiences as well. We'll ignore all of that. The weird photographs are just to illustrate that my career started in the British Army, and for a while I was also a builder of robotic computer-controlled sculptures, but we'll worry about those things another day. If we move on to the next slide. So what was the purpose, or what is the purpose of a scenario? So, people can sometimes get a bit confused and think that scenarios are a vision of what the future is going to be. Scenarios are really there to try and give some plausible options on how the future may turn out. And the idea is that they are consistent. So when you create scenarios, you create them in a way that means that they all have a logic that links them together, even though they lead into different potential views of how the world might be. Usually they're designed to be reasonably extreme, because you want to push into the different possibilities that are likely to affect the way in which companies or organizations think about planning for the future. And it's important to stretch when you're trying to do that. And they're really ideally put together so that when you're devising a new strategy or a new area of business or work, that you design it in such a way that it can be successful or effective in as many of the possible scenarios as possible. So you're trying to ensure that the way in which you devise your own future plans is something that will be effective and be able to deal with a range of different future scenarios. And that's really the purpose that was behind these. If we move on to the next, I'm going to go fairly rapidly through this, and we can ask questions. So the first thing we do is design a business as usual, the baseline scenario. So what is it that we that we expect to be happening more generally? And from the information that we gathered and the insights that we were able to understand, this is what we think most people in the foundation industry sector are expecting or have factored into the way in which they were planning their future. So this is about a gradual slowing of the markets that they're in as far as the UK goes. No great increase in the innovation that's taking place across the industry. So it's not as though this is an area or a time when people are expecting to make significant changes to the R&D part of what they're doing. Where there is innovation, it's driven by demand rather than internal projections, and that the investment that's going on remains very much based around asset development, and that the changes that are being put forward are likely to be putting those assets in similar places to where they are at the moment and on a similar sort of scale. So very much a steady, what we would think of as a steady as she goes type business as usual baseline. So that's where we identified that we felt most of the people we spoke to and the information we gathered would indicate the expectation of the future to be. The next slide gives you the 4 scenarios that we developed here, and the 2 axes, high stress and low stress, are about the degree of stress within the system overall. So, you know, how much stress is the system going to be dealing with, and the x-axis is about whether or not the industries involved are being reactive or proactive in the way in which they are dealing with and planning for the future. So you can see 4 scenarios: constant flux, high stress, high reactivity type of scenario, across to internally driven flourishing, which is very much proactive and low stress, so driven by industries and in an area or not creating a huge amount of stress on the way in which they need to operate in the future. So that's the basis, and those are the 4 that I will discuss briefly. So if we move to the next slide, so now we've got scenario 1, which we called constant flux. So here there are, you know, really very little stability. Lots of external changes going on that are affecting the foundation industries. These are driven by, you know, a range of different things. Interruptions to material flow as a result of geopolitical factors, extreme climate events, the economic pressure changing feedstock price and availability. I think some of these we may have seen in the last year or 2. Energy availability becomes uncertain because the transfer from coal and old nuclear to new forms or new plants, even of the same, is not smooth. And as a result, we find that there are rolling blackouts, there are other things that interrupts gas supplies, and the speed of renewables is not as fast or as effective as was expected. So energy becomes a problem. Foundation industries outside of the UK are also responding to this, and as they have a lowering of demand at certain times, they can dump capacity into the UK market, which is poor outcome for UK foundation industries, and so on. So these are the sorts of things that we saw and projected forward that would be likely to create this lack of stability in the overall market. And as a result, you know, high demand is, or expected demand is rarely met, and there's a lot of time when throughput is far from optimal. The downturns are not on a cyclical basis; they're often surprises, as we've seen in the last year or 2. Sometimes they're extended, sometimes they're fairly short and sharp, but they are difficult to predict what the future is likely to be. And as a result, when thinking about investment, it's difficult to understand what are going to be the right sort of investment cycles to plan for. So that's the constant flux scenario. If we can look at the next scenario, which we've called constrained technology flow. So here, this is where we are looking at the flow of technology, not driven by straightforward government and industry-based planning and capacity, but more by external events. And on this basis, we were thinking about the fact that the UK government continues to focus on high-tech, financial, pharmaceutical sectors for its main investment. And so getting meaningful follow-on for future R&D and investment support in the foundation industries becomes more difficult. Carbon accounting, you know, isn't set up in a way that is conducive to helping the foundation industries, and therefore we find that that there are quite a lot of constraints on the way in which technology is uptake is driven. Availability of finance becomes part of that. The number of and supply of customer demand changes. For instance, some of the key customers for the UK foundation industry may move some of their manufacturing out of the UK and into Europe, and therefore buy their foundation industry feedstock locally, declining or depleting the UK market. Some of the new manufacturing that's required for of process equipment that's required for transforming foundation industries is mostly being developed in China, and exports become restricted as China tries to hit its own net zero goals. So there's less availability of the next range of technology and process capability for the UK market. So there's a number of things we can see here. At the same time, because of the demand is stronger in Asia than it is in Europe, which is clearly a predicted direction, then more factories, more investment tends to be made in those markets, and that pulls the net amount of money that's available for investment away from Europe and particularly away from the UK. And at the back of all of that, the UK and other national governments just say, okay, the foundation industry should be market driven, and therefore they are not taking an interventionist position, or they're setting policies around material security as a priority, overall, the ability to make technology investments in what would ideally be a stable environment is reduced. So that would be our overall idea of constrained technology as a future scenario. If we move on to number 3, so here we're looking at flourishing. So if the first 2 are more negative scenarios, the second 2 are more positive. And generally, when you're putting scenarios together, it's important to try and get a balance of different types of potential future. So this is a flourishing of the foundation industries driven by internal change. So here we're suggesting that material circularity has been cracked, has been solved substantially by UK government research into a range of different areas in some of the customers of foundation industry feedstocks, and therefore it's possible for the materials to be reclaimed and reused and brought back into service. And as a result, the foundation industry starts to think about different business models where it's possible to retain ownership. So models where instead of selling the base materials, they are in some ways retaining ownership, and there could be a number of different models for ownership retention here. But the idea being that there is an expectation, an ability to bring material back, whether it's from the construction or automotive industry, whether it's from distribution industry, bringing back and being able to reuse the substantial amounts of cardboard that are now in the system. And depends on the industry sector, but there are ways that this is reduced. And as a result, there's a lower requirement for external raw material virgin feedstocks, an increased ability to mine and reuse material that already exists within the nation. And on the back of that, there are new subsectors that start to emerge that are about the conditioning of those feedstocks or for reuse in the industry, or others that are to do with the way that the the material itself is managed during its life and life cycle in order to be able to ensure that when it does come back, it's understood how it's been used and what it's suitable for. So that's scenario three, an internally driven way of doing things. And if we finally move on to scenario 4, which is the other flourishing scenario, here we're looking at an externally fed form of flourishing. So this is where the expectation is not that these things have been driven by industry, but these have been driven by the solving some of the problems around carbon capture, usage and storage, the ability to manufacture and use hydrogen effectively and distribute it, the driving of the electricity as a fundamental energy source, so that it's equivalent or cheaper than natural gas. So as a result, there's the ability for the foundation industries to become very cost effective in the way in which they're operating, and there are changes that come about in this scenario, where the competitiveness of the UK foundation industries starts to outperform that of other foundation industry providers elsewhere, and therefore the industry sector starts to grow on the basis of exporting. So those are the 4 scenarios that we developed. Just to bring you back to putting them onto that matrix. That's a very quick overview of those 4 scenarios and their development. I'm happy to take a few questions if people have some to ask around that.
Thank you very much, Ian. We have about 2 minutes, people, for questions. So if there is anything you want to ask please put it in the chat or use the raise hand function, and I'll quickly be able to see you there. But thank you, Ian. That was a really useful overview. We will quickly put the slides up in the mural, both the one we're using today and also the exhibition area. Paul, you've come in first. You will have to unmute yourself, Paul. We're so pro. After 2.5 years, we're all so pro at doing this. You're still unmuted. You're still muted, Paul. I'm going to bring in, is it Feiha? You've also got your hand up there. Hello.
Hello. Yeah.
Just while we're waiting for Paul to unmute, you get to go first.
Okay, all right. Well, that's great. Hello, Ian. I'm Fiona Leśniewska, researcher on circular economy and mineral-based construction at UCL. Out of the scenarios through your workshops, what were the actual outcomes? What were the responses, and where was the preferences, and how did the industry and representatives think that they would get there?
So it's a good question, but unfortunately not one that I can directly answer. So the intention and the use of these scenarios was from UKRI, who wanted to understand when they were going to evaluate where they'd made investments in different foundation industry research, how they would look at and be able to score or evaluate the effectiveness of that investment. So typically they're putting investment in place over a number of years, quite a number of years for many of these. So they might be running a program of work over 5 years. And what they wanted to understand is, when they come to evaluate that, because they like to set their evaluation up at the beginning, will their evaluation hold true under these different scenarios situations? So it wasn't really looking and going back to the industries themselves to say, here are these scenarios, what are you going to do about it? It was actually, it had a different purpose.
Okay, thanks, Ian. And just bringing in Paul very briefly, and then we'll hand over to Anne. Oh, Paul, we still can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we
yes.
can hear you now.
Great.
Oh,
God
beautiful.
knows what's going on with it. Right, Ian, thank you. Ian, thank you for the presentation. It was very, very helpful. You've already partially answered the question, but in terms of the value proposition, for scenario 4, it would be great going forwards if the size of the prize could be articulated, because ultimately, the value will drive those investments. But also, there's a value proposition associated with the first scenario as well, which is something I think would be very useful to have, because it indicates the drive between scenario 1 and scenario 4. So that's something that you are, in terms of work in progress, seeking to do.
It would be fascinating to do, Paul. I absolutely agree with you. It isn't something we've been commissioned to look at, so we haven't been working on what the value propositions, and they might vary, to be frank, from industry to industry. But it would be a very, very pertinent area to look at, and I think in particular you've identified the probably the most likely arc of these scenarios between 1 and 4. Or at least 1, I think, is most representative of the world we're seeing at the moment. It doesn't necessarily mean it will stay that way. 4, I think, probably still to some extent represents the hope of the foundation industries as we experienced through our interviews, which is that, and I'll be blunt here, which is that government will rescue the future for foundation industries by solving some of these infrastructure requirements in order to allow the change that's required to happen. And I think that's broadly, that would, if I were to encapture what we heard, I would say there was a lot of, that would be great if that could be an outcome. What we tend to be seeing at the moment is more of scenario 1, and I'm not sure. I think the value proposition for scenario 4 for the industries would be a very powerful one to take back and work with government on. So that would be the best answer I can give you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ian. I can see that Mark's keen to get a question in, but we are on a very tight time schedule, Mark. So would you be able to just pop your question? Oh, it's a comment. Okay.
What I would say is that I would believe that somewhere between 3 and 4 is what the Transfire proposal was written around, which is potentially why it was selected as the project that went forward, and that is certainly something that Anne will be talking about in her presentation, and the feedback that didn't come from the industry but will back up what Ian has just presented is, I believe, what we've been finding and what Anne hopefully will present in the next presentation. So it's a joined up story in that sense.
Thank you very much, and that's a very nice segue into our next presentation for today. So thank you very much, Ian, for joining us from your car. We hope that your cat is on path to recovery. And I'm going to hand over now to Anne, because Anne and the Transfire team have been assessing some of these cross-sectorial challenges that are going to need to be addressed, and starting to prepare us for any of those future scenarios. So Anne, over to you. I've got your slides ready to go. If you just bear with me 2 secs. And there we go.
Great. Thank you, Christina. Thank you so much, Ian, for your presentation. Yeah, I'll present some of the cross-sectoral challenges that we have been finding. So if you could go to the next slide, please.
Sorry, I'm just I was just grabbing my tea, to be honest.
I see. And you can, why don't you just click again, and because this one is animated. Right. So basically what I thought would be useful is to start this presentation by showing the kind of development pathway that I'm certainly seeing with Transfire. And that is that the foundation industries are on a pathway from reforming practices to transforming practices. So reforming practices is about basically doing what you currently are doing, but doing it much better. So that is what I would call reformative change. And if you could click again, Christine. Right. So, and then the other end of it is transformative change, which is about rethinking what we are doing, why are we doing it, how are we doing it, like that. So, and if you can click again. So I think that this is a mixture of the scenarios that Ian was presenting, probably mostly the constant flux and the flourishing internally driven scenarios. And what we find in discussions with numerous stakeholders actually is that that jump between reformative change and transformative change is often too big to make at once. Actually, we don't really know too well what that transformative change exactly would look like in practice. So what we're looking for really is to create stepping stones in between so that we can really move the various industries forward and get you all on the same kind of pathway towards transformative change. So you can click again. Right, so today I want to share some of the cross-industry challenges that we have been finding that make it difficult to achieve transformative change. So the analysis that I'm presenting is based on information that we gathered already during the writing of the Transfire proposal with 60 project partners from outside of academia, via our technical working groups, via our various other committees and advisory bodies that we have in Transfire as part of our governance structure, and also at our launch event where lots of people contributed what they see as the key challenges moving forward. And from that, we identified 8 key sort of challenge areas, which are energy, resources, continuous improvement, collaboration and innovation, economics, governance, careers, and public engagement. And under each of these areas, there are a number of challenges, which I have tried to organize in the next slides, according to a PESEL analysis, which is the little figure that you see there in the right bottom corner. So just to try to structure a little bit what we're looking at, because otherwise it's just a big mess, really. Right, so, and we'll go through each of these areas one at a time, just not to overwhelm you too much, but I want you to see the big picture. And basically the bubbles, when they are overlapping or connecting, it means that there's some kind of association between them. So actually what we see is really, I guess you could say, a complex bundle of challenges that we need to resolve somehow all at the same time. So if you could click again, please. So the first one to look at are the environmental challenges. So here we see challenges around, of course, recycling and enabling industrial symbiosis, so making much better use of wastes and byproducts, but also very much to go beyond that as well. So to reduce, for example, water in particular, but also to reduce demand for resources as well. And then another challenge that came up is to actually mine previous landfills, because of course foundation industries have created quite a few landfills, and now it turns out that there is still valuable material in there that we can mine and clean up the environment, basically. And the thing that I would also like you to take away from this slide is that the challenges for environment and for resource use are very much interconnected with other challenge areas. So you see that there's a link there to continuous improvement. In terms of improving recycling and reducing demand, there is much to do around public engagement. And of course, everything actually depends on better collaboration and innovation as well, which is actually very challenging in foundation industries. And I'll get to that towards the end of the presentation as well. Okay, next slide, please. Right, so in terms of technical challenges, I kind of think that this audience will understand the technical challenges the best of every of the challenge areas, certainly much better than I would understand them. But in terms of the area for energy, of course, there's lots of challenges around reducing energy use, improving efficiency, if it's still possible to improve efficiencies further, and switching to alternatives. Really important priority challenge area that has come forward already is about heat recovery. And the problem, of course, with the energy use is that it's very expensive and is carbon intensive. And that then has a link there to the economics, which I'll cover a bit later as well. Continuous improvement is another area where technical innovation can make a lot of impact. So here we see digital solutions, which already also came forward in our introductory spins, which is great to hear. And of course, benchmarking. So understanding where are we now and how can we improve? And again, that requires collaboration and innovation. And of course, the continuous improvements is also very much linked to improving resource use. So minimizing resource use, making better use of waste and byproducts. Right, so the next slide, please. Right, so in terms of economic challenges, we see a real cluster here of challenges emerging. So as I mentioned, high costs are really an issue for the UK, combined with relatively low productivity, as I've been told. And that then combined with foreign competition, where perhaps there's sometimes more state support and where production can be at higher scale, can be that actually in the investment picture looks more attractive. And then it makes it difficult to get investment to UK sites. And the thing is also that, of course, many of the UK sites are foreign owned. So you also see the competition within the groups. Why would you invest in the UK rather than in mainland Europe, where maybe you have easier access to a bigger market? I think that we need to see a lot of business model innovation to really leapfrog away from the current standards, sort of the business as usual business model. Really happy to discuss more about that as well. Again, all of this is very much dependent on interacting with governance and with, again, collaboration and innovation as well. Right, next slide. So in terms of social challenges, we've got quite a few here, but also actually, I think there's lots of opportunity here. So already mentioned that collaboration and innovation is actually, it's important and cutting across most of the other challenge areas. But the problem is that actually it seems that within foundation industries and also especially across foundation industries, that there is a low collaborative capacity. And often there's also a challenge of low innovativeness, which must have something to do with the small margins, leaving less money for innovation. So there really is a problem there with the whole innovation system for foundation industries in the UK, where I think we will have to do much work to strengthen that. The opportunities then exist around jobs, because if we can manage to transform foundation industries, then we create green jobs that are attractive to young people, and we can create a really different kind of foundation industry where people really want to work. In terms of equality, diversity, and inclusion, that also means that there's much to be won from that, of course. I think the problem with skilled staff and offering more training, it seems that it's especially difficult to get staff in who can actually change production lines, who can implement, who can build those new manufacturing facilities. And also I noticed that there may be an issue with skilled staff to actually manage innovation processes as well. So I think that there's lots of opportunity there and really interesting jobs that can be created, but it will probably require investment, which I refer back to previous slide on economics, which might be a barrier. The next slide, please. Yeah, so the governance side of it, so covering political and legal aspects. Sustainability governance was mentioned, sometimes positive, sometimes not so positive. I'll link that through to regulation and implementation. Often regulation is seen as a barrier, especially in terms of making use of waste and byproducts. So definition of waste is an often mentioned challenge that needs to be resolved. I would say that in the UK, I think generally we have a low capacity in the governance system to actually implement regulations in an optimal way. Of course, we seem to be constantly falling into new economic crises, with resulting in plans for economic regeneration, impacting heavily on foundation industries. So that was certainly a key theme that has been coming through time and again. If we want to transform foundation industries, then it's probably necessary to also change the overriding economic model for the whole of the UK as well. So there's a nice little challenge for us. So you can see here that it's again linked to other challenge areas. And I think if we go to the last slide, you can see here the whole picture of the challenges brought together again. And the last thing that I would like to add to the discussion, just to prime it a little bit, if you could click, please, Christine, there's some animations here. So part of the challenges are technical in nature, but a very big part of the challenges are also non-technical in nature. And I think that there's a tendency to focus a lot on the technical ones, and that is really important. And there's lots of really fantastic research and innovation going on in that. But I think it needs to be joined up more with the non-technical challenges as well, if we actually want to implement those technological opportunities for progress. So that was all I had, a really quick whistle-stop tour, and trying to get us back on track as well in terms of timing. I'm happy to take questions if there is time for that.
But for now, we're going to move on. We thought we would start to try and bring this really interesting session together. And I'm delighted that we've got Ben Walsh with us. I'll get him to introduce himself in a moment. So Ben and Anne and Mark Jolly are going to be joining me in a little bit of a panel discussion here to really just reflect on what's been said, but also to look forward, to start to explore how might we be moving forward, both in terms of research and innovation. How might we start to move forward? What can we do to proactively control the future direction of the foundation industries, rather than in that first scenario that Ian talked about, just kind of expecting this is going to be how it is and just going with the flow of it. So what can we start to do that? So we've invited Ben and Anne and Mark to just reflect on some of those seedlings that came up in that conversation, some of the things that you started seeing emerge on the mural, and also just to give us a sense of how that might affect the things that they know are happening in terms of future funding calls. So Ben, do you want to just kick us off and just tell us a bit about who you are and where your role is? I'm just waiting for you to be spotlighted.
Brilliant. Okay, now I can just see a big picture of myself.
I know, it's distressing, isn't it? I'm going to spotlight me as well, so then you can join in the conversation, and I'll get Anne spotlighted, and then you won't feel quite as much in the big panel.
See, I'm Ben Walsh. I'm the Deputy Challenge Director for Transforming Foundation Industries, which is kind of the umbrella fund from which Transfire is an important part of it. And if you'll indulge me for 10 seconds, I went back to our original grant application. So although obviously most academics here know they apply for grants, me as a middleman sitting in UKRI also has to apply for the funding application. And there was 80 words associated with what is essentially turned out to be Transfire. An entire document, 80 words. I won't read them out. They're not very well written by me, unfortunately, but I am overwhelmed at the quality of the work and the people around me who are now leading this. I feel that I've been trying to catch a wave for 3 years around foundation industries, and this feels that I can stand up and start to serve, although I can't serve. And so I'm really pleased that hopefully these very clever people around me will take forward the mission that we're trying to solve, which is ultimately save the planet. So that's kind of I think my take on today has been absolutely amazing. And you wanted do you want a couple of starters for 10?
Yeah, just to kind of a couple of things that you've just found really interesting and positive about today, Ben.
So I've got some themes, but we'll talk about the themes a little bit. But I think two things which I picked up, which given that I essentially joined a technology organization, we're about delivering technology. I feel the challenge is not necessarily technology focused. The technology is kind of the enabler. So two things that I kind of picked up was one, I picked up a poster which can help people understand the size of the challenge, and I think that is really important. Is that and this links back to the first talk on scenarios. There's two positive scenarios. One's around technology is going to save us all, and the other's around people are going to save us all, essentially. And realizing there's probably a mix of the both, and recognizing a lot of people who don't know much about this will go, well, surely we just stick a CC, we just capture all the carbon and store it underground. So no, it's going to be much more complicated than that, and understanding the complexity of it is really, really key. And kind of the other side of the complexity then is I saw a really good one, and it's super difficult. It's on a super difficult part of the thing. Was monitoring? I can't remember right now. Monitoring and sharing of information across the supply chain. this is not, I don't think, the challenge. And actually, my thoughts moved a long way, actually. The problem is not going to be solved by the foundation industries themselves. The problem is a societal problem, and actually the supply chain is going to be really key to this. And so I think that those are kind of two big things, you know, is promoting just how difficult this is to wider groups of people, but also then saying that if we can talk and work across that supply chain, which again is super difficult, is going to make a big change as well.
Thanks, Ben. And Anne, what about for you? What's been a couple of interesting, positive things that have been there for you in these conversations?
Well, first of all, how active everyone has taken part, and to see the great diversity of ideas emerging on the mural has been brilliant. Actually, I'm really happy to see all of that. I had 2 points, and the one is a little bit similar to what Ben was saying, but actually it's the importance of mapping. There were several post-its prioritized about mapping. So what are the solutions available? What is the direction of travel for foundation industries? What are the missing skills? So actually the importance of mapping across foundation industries, which is something that hopefully with Transfire we can help with. The other one that I found really interesting that came out was about developing a green taxonomy for investors. Investment is so important. I think the transformation of foundation industries will largely stand and fall with investment. It will be incredibly interesting actually to work on such green taxonomy together with other partners. So I thought that was a very, very interesting idea to raise.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Anne.
Oh, I really like that last one, actually, the investors. I'm an ex-consultant, so I always put things into threes. So, I find very much the big things we came across were 3 things. One around was kind of cultural change, and that kind of cultural change is both, wide societal, but also from companies. And that brings the ESG, particularly EDI and ESG kind of within kind of a cultural thing. The technological bit, which is a bit we're all pretty familiar with and understand, kind of both hard technology and soft technology. But then the economics, I think the economics are absolutely crucial in terms of that as well. So I didn't write investor down, but investment's really good, and kind of the cost change and the market, how the market appreciates these technologies, and then you bring in things like circular economy activities as well. Really key.
Yeah, I agree, Ben, and I think there's a really big education exercise to happen, which probably is that the city needs to recognize that this is part of our society, and that we can't go on expecting investors to get profits after 6 months or 12 months of investment. That this is the backbone of what our society is. These materials are the backbone, and that investment in these industries must be a much longer term exercise. We don't do it very well in the UK. There are some countries in Europe which do it rather better than we do, and maybe there are some lessons to learn there. I mean, I know we bang on about the German sort of Mittelstand, which sort of the banks get involved rather than the stock markets, and along with a longer term view. But I think that's something that's really important. And the second point I'd like to make is that we created this problem in 1707 when Abraham Darby invented the cooking pot and then had to invent the blast furnace fired by coke to create enough material to satisfy his market need. So we've got to do 2 things. We've got to change the market needs. Do we need to have as many cooking pots, which is the dematerialization aspect? But we also can't carry on solving a problem that we've created with the same team that created it. The team that created it was basically white middle-class men, and that's unfortunately hasn't changed very much. That's a bit of a generalization, I must admit, within the foundation industries. I know Nina will probably be pulling a face there at me, but it's generally the case. And we have to change the culture within the industries about who can contribute to these very basic materials. And so we've got to change the business models, and we've got to change the diversity in very, very many ways across the whole of these industries. We won't solve the problem from within using the same teams, because the same thinking will carry on. We have to change the thinking. So that diversity of thought can only come by changing the types of team that we have at the top, not just at the bottom, at the top.
That's great. And we've also got some really nice comments. I won't be able to read them all, but there's some great comments coming in from the chat there. So thanks, Phil. Thanks, Peter. Thanks, Sue. And John. Gosh, it's active in the chat. And Anne, you want to jump in there?
I do, yeah, because it was actually one of the points that I certainly also wrote down to respond to. So I noticed that there were several solutions being prioritized about changing mindsets in the senior management, but also in commercial teams within companies. And, you know, I listened to the discussion just before the break with great interest. And in my view, it's certainly not just about the cash. Okay, of course, solutions and innovations, they have to make commercial sense. But if you are in a sustainable economy, then it cannot be anymore just about the cash, and certainly not just about the short-term cash. It really requires a change in mindset and in looking at in the long-term business cases in a multidimensional way. So yes, economy, of course, but also about environment, also about social value. So that really, you know, it's about a change in terms of the role of business in society. Companies are not just there to make money for shareholders. Companies have a far greater responsibility, and they can do far better than just that. So I think that requires, I think that's something that we should prioritize to work on. And I'll bring that back to the investment case as well, because it's of course difficult to balance that, you know, in the short term companies are under that short-term pressure to generate profits. So how do we link that to the long-term business case? And I think for companies in the UK, we're going to have to leapfrog. It is my belief for, you know, having worked on foundation industries now for a while, but I really find it difficult to see how you could beat companies like China in terms of scale and in terms of cost of production with the current business models. I think it's going to be very difficult. And I think the way to beat them is actually to leapfrog towards business models in which you value resources more, in which foundation industries integrate more into their supply chain and become much more involved in servitization, but also in business models that design things for reuse, for repair, for remanufacturing, and get actively involved in that. That is a much more localized market. It's a market where profit margins will be higher. I think that makes a much better case for investment. I'll leave it there.
And I'll bring Ben in because he's got his hand raised and ready to go.
Yes, interesting. So actually that ties in. I love some Phil Pennell's comments, really good actually. So and that kind of links in with what Anne was saying, is that I think that's the thesis that I've kind of come to is that actually if you focus on demand, and so market case or market demand for lower carbon products, you've got a real opportunity here to actually develop a stronger national capability around these technologies. And so that is something that we're exploring is how can demand drive innovation and demand drive decarbonisation. We start to see a little bit from government, but I think government could have an active role, but the approach from government is really to be the grease in the wheels, is not to actually be maybe the main driver towards demand. It should be there to encourage companies to drive demand. It should be maybe there to, you know, the external body, you know, HS2 or whatever it may be, to drive demand around low carbon products, and that then will breed these newer business models and this newer way of doing work. And really, I focus really thinking that actually should do this with end customers, being businesses or business activities. Now I don't know. It's too big a group really, but it'd be interesting to know how many people we're engaging who are more on the customer, who are the end, you know, who are the end, you know, in society, because I think that, and come back to Mark's point about to change this, we need to engage different groups of people. And I think actually the social scientists, the people on behavioural change from the wider population, is a way that I think we're going to need to drive innovation and decarbonise the economy, particularly if we're going to do things like dematerialisation, which fundamentally means us all buying less stuff, and buying less stuff is you talk to any economist or anyone in Treasury or even in Base, say, yeah, we want to buy less things. That's generally considered quite a poor, you're going to get a poor outcome from those conversations.
So what I'm hearing is that it's starting to look about research themes that are not just about they're not purely focused on technical solutions, but starting to broaden that out into other things. Mark, what are you seeing in terms of the future research agendas? I know you've got a really good eye on what's out there and your antennae is really good for this. Oh, you're muted.
I'm muted. So no, I really think Ben makes this incredibly important part. I mean, Transfire does have social scientists in it. I mean, we have probably something like a fifth of the funding is going into the social sciences, maybe a little bit more than a fifth of the funding. But it's possibly, I mean, and we are looking at transforming or trying to transform social attitudes. But I think the big challenge when you have the retail sector, you know, if you look at the textile sector, retail, textiles, things like clothing, which is a massive sector which uses material. It is, you know, it's the Primarks of the world, which actually, it's not a question of, yeah, we can recycle the products at the end. It's why are we selling them so cheap in the first place? And I think Anne's comments about servitization, we know that there are now lots of examples of servitization of products like clothes. We started to do it with automotive. We just have to get the materials industries, the foundation industries, in the supply chain of those products to be involved in the same thought processes and the same business models. That's a challenge. So I think that research challenge of going through and getting an integrated approach to servitization. Products are easier to servitize than materials, let's put it that way, but there's no reason why it can't be the whole supply chain if we think about it in a different way. So I think that's one of the research challenges. And I think, you know, we can do all the technology we like. We've got a lot of expertise in the technology, but it really is a combined approach. We have to go back to the thinking of that sustainability 3 pillars. I know people don't like talking about this, but you've got to have environmental impact, you've got to have social impact, and you've got to have economic impact. And you have to balance those 3 things together. We need to, and the balance is not necessarily about just in the economic side, is not just about making more and more profit all the time. It's about making it sustainable, making it continuous. It's not growing everything. You know, growth is not about just taking more and more and more and more of the Earth's resources. We have to think growth of a business model, or the business model of growing GDP. Is that the right way to go? And that's a challenge for the likes of Ben in government. It really is a challenge. Getting the Treasury to think in a different way is one of the biggest challenges. But we are trying to work on that. We're working on policy. We have now a stream of work that is aimed at policy. I don't know whether Ben wants to say anything about that, but it is an important aspect of transfer.
I was handing over to Ben. I will comment that there are some fierce conversations happening in the chat. We won't be able to bring them all in, but just a little pointer from Steve about we seem to have strayed into changing the global economy debate. It was quite enough to try and change the UK. So I think there's some really interesting conversations in the chat as well. And Anne's even had time to respond to one of them whilst being on the panel. So kudos to Anne. Ben, you got cued in there by Mark. We've only got a couple of minutes left, panel.
Okay, so yes, so it is interesting that, you know, from a policy perspective, 4 years ago when we were talking around the challenge, net zero wasn't a thing. Resource efficiency wasn't. In fact, resource efficiency was just dead in the water. In fact, one of the reasons I changed my job was because resource efficiency was dead in the water. I'm really kind of coming full circle now. So BEIs are starting to see the value of this. They have a bit of a problem in that it's not, in resource efficiency in particular, and energy efficiency to its slightly extent, it's really hard to monetize it in the same way you do if you're building a CHP plant or you're building a wind turbine, because you've got to look at the whole model, and looking at the whole model is really much harder for them to do. And so we're trying to educate them, and they totally understand that they're trying to educate them to solve some of these challenges. And it's quite exciting, but because it is a system change, it's going to take a lot longer and a bit of a different thing. It's not a traditional taxation lever or banning lever that you'd normally pull from a government perspective. So watch this space.
So just to wrap this up, what would you all love to see happening as a consequence of some of these discussions from today? So Anne, if I can bring you in.
Putting me on the spot. Thank
Yeah.
you. Okay, what would I like to see happening? I would like to see government recognizing the opportunity case of this. And I would like to see more investment into these really radical and risky innovations that we are asking our foundation industries in the UK to do. You know, make no mistake, they are very much dependent, of course, in terms of uptake in the supply chain, you know, and creating the demand. It's scary. You don't really know if that demand is going to be there. So it could be really, you know, it could create issues for your company. So I think that government must recognize that alongside of the importance of actually doing it, and create alternative funding and finance investment mechanisms to support with that. So that is where I'd like to see much more action moving forward.
Thank you. Ben, what about for you? What would you like to see? Just one thing you'd like to see happening from today?
Well, I guess yeah, the number one thing that I want to see is start to change the debate from the foundation industries from what is essentially a set of industries which are just a bit of a problematic, they keep coming back for more money and eventually going to disappear, to one that actually has seen the value of society, they're valued in society for what they are. And the reason that I can't claim that I chose the name foundation industries, but I picked it up for the challenge largely because energy intensive suggests it's a problem that needs to be solved, whereas foundation industries is something that you will require and you will want in the future. And that is why that I don't use the word energy intensive, largely because it's about getting rid of them. This is about ensuring that they are part of our economy for the next 100 years, because they will be, and ensuring that they are is important.
Thank you very much. And Mark, final word for you.
I'll come back to people. I want to see a wider range of people. I want to see the industries, the foundation industries, which are basically targeted as Dante's infernos of fire, smoke and brimstone. I want them to be places where people actually would like to work, would want to work, and would see they're contributing to society because they are fundamental to our life and what we do. Everything I see in people's backgrounds, they're all part of the materials sector. They're all part of what we have and do in the foundation industries. And, you know, getting the teams right and making it attractive places to work, however we do that, by diverse teams, but also by the inclusion of things like the digitization, the robotization, the automation, and all those aspects which can be applied, I think will make an amazing difference and change the perception outside, in the outer, you know, in society of these industries.
Thank you. Thank you so much to our panelists for stepping in, for reflecting, for pulling that together. And thank you to everyone for making the conversation go so lively in terms of the stuff that's captured in the chat.